thank you, Professor Moffitt. We are running out of time, so we move to the next session.
Okay, well, thank you, Shen Shuai.
Now we will have four papers to present, and for each paper we will have 20 to 25 minutes to present, and 5 to 10 minutes for the Q&A. And the first speaker is Laura Zimmerman from University of Georgia, and she's also a GLO member. She is going to talk about the effect of cash transfer on sex ratio. Now let's give time to Laura.
Thank you very much. Yeah, let's pull this up here. So I'm starting us off here on, I guess, welfare benefits related to children in this session. And so I'll be focusing on India, and this is joint work with Namanita Biswas, who's at Marshall University, and Christopher Cornwall, who's also at the University of Georgia. And we really started with the realization that, as probably most of you are aware, there are massive numbers of women categorized as missing, according to Amartya Sen's sort of seminal contributions. So by some estimates, recently on the order of 126 million women worldwide. Every year, there's about 1.6 million girls that are added to that, either because they're never born due to sex-selective abortion, or because they die after birth due to sex-selective neglect. And if you look at the country breakdown, actually India and China account for by far the lion's share of this issue, raising, of course, the question, what, if anything, can governments do to alleviate this problem and maybe reduce son preference? I'll give you bit of an overview of how this looks like in India. And so many of you might know the number 1.05, which is sort of the biologically expected boy to girl ratio, certainly across contexts, across countries. And what I've done here is plotted the sex ratio at the child level. So this is for 0 to 6-year-olds for the last 2 Indian censuses. So on the left here, we have the 2001 census compared to then the 2011 census. And really here, everything from a sort of darker orange down to red are states that have a sex ratio that is skewed towards boys a lot more than we'd expect based on these biological ratios. And so as you can see here, even over the 10-year period, actually more of that map becomes red or darker orange. And so even with sort of modernizing forces like massive economic growth, like higher education levels and so on, the problem of son preference only seems to become more urgent rather than improving. And our interest, therefore, is the question, is the question of what kind of policy tools are there that governments might have in their arsenal to get on this. We just heard a bit about social welfare programs, and so conditional cash transfer programs, or CCTs, maybe come to mind, especially in a developing country context, as one potentially potent such tool. Certainly in Latin America, but also in other countries around the world, CCTs have been spectacularly effective at improving school attendance rates, at improving health outcomes. And so maybe not surprisingly, in India, actually, there have been over 20 girl-child CCTs that try to pay parents to have a girl and then to invest in that girl post-birth in an effort to reduce son preference and sort of alleviate the problem of skewed sex ratios. Unfortunately, we know very, very little about the track record of these programs, even though they have been around for quite some time. Only one of them has been evaluated by Anukriti in 2018. And this program was actually found to do the opposite of what was hoped. So actually, the son preference there strengthened, sex ratio worsened, despite financial incentives to have a girl. And so for us, this really begs the question of, is the entire CCT program really an ineffective or even harmful program that should not be used to try to attack some preference? Or was that one program that has been studied just problematic due to certain design features? And so what we're doing is therefore try to go as much on the opposite end of the spectrum in terms of design features from this Devi-Rupak scheme that Anakriti studied. And so we're going to focus on the Dhanlakshmi scheme, which was a central government pilot program introduced in 2008. It has payouts for girls reaching certain milestones, which include registering the birth of a girl, getting her immunized, then has payouts for pretty much every year of schooling. And then there's a final payout at age 18, conditional on the girl having remained unmarried. Now, the big design differences to older programs, including the Devi-Rupak scheme by Anakriti's analysis, is really the lack of a lot of restrictions. So there is no income restriction whatsoever, whereas commonly the program would be targeted to people below the poverty line or a certain threshold. There is no restriction on the number of girls that can be enrolled within a family. Again, typically there would be a restriction to 1 or 2 girls per household. And there is no restriction on family size. Typically, programs really worried about leading to a massive increase in fertility if you start paying parents to have kids. So a lot of programs, including this Devi-Rupak scheme, actually imposed massive fertility restrictions, typically either requiring sterilization or another terminal family planning method. So very intrusive, very restrictive program, and households would lose eligibility if they had more children. In our program, that's not the case, and so eligibility is solely based on your residency. So as long as you can prove that you live in one of these pilot areas, you're eligible for the program. This is just to give you a bit of a sense of what these payouts look like and how incremental these payouts are. So there's initial 5,000 rupee payout once the girl is enrolled and her birth is registered. You can see here very fine-grained immunization payouts to ensure that the girl gets immunized. And then there are payouts every year as long as the girl continues going to school and advances in grades, and then sort of that final big payout of 100,000 rupees at the end at age 18 if she's still unmarried. Now, if you think about magnitudes here, think of 100,000 rupees as being roughly like $1,000, so a sizable payout here for poor families in India. But in the area that we'll be studying, even that 5,000 rupee initial payout is actually equivalent to 1 month of average household income and expenditures. So these are actually meaningful magnitudes here. As I mentioned, important differences from other schemes, mostly in the sense that the Dhanlakshmi scheme does not actually restrict fertility in any way, whereas previous programs were really worried about massive increases to fertility. And so our main interest, therefore, first order interest, is in figuring out what is the impact of this Dhanlakshmi scheme on the sex ratio, but then also on fertility outcomes. And then we'll also look at some other post-birth outcomes, specifically immunization and education. So let me tell you a bit more about this pilot program and how and where it was implemented. So 7 states received treatment areas. And in those 7 states, 11 blocks were picked to receive the program. So in India, administratively, you have the state, then the district, and then the block level. And so this would mean that a tiny portion potentially of an overall district would be receiving the program, whereas the rest of the state would not. Now, out of these 11 treatment areas, we'll actually be focusing just on this first one, so the district of Fatehgarh Sahib and its treatment block, Sirhind. And we do this for 2 reasons. First, if we're interested in studying the sex ratio, we might actually want to study a context where sun preference was a problem at baseline. And so what I've done here is actually pulled the child sex ratio from the 2001 census, so the baseline for these treatment areas. India typically reports the number of girls per 1,000 boys. So think of the biologically expected sex ratio as in the 950s. And so based on that, actually the entire treatment areas in East and South India had completely normal sex ratios at baseline. The area in Uttar Pradesh was slightly below that expected ratio, but really only Fatehgarh Sahib had sort of that dark red, kind of very skewed sex ratio where we might think sun preference was actually a big issue. So conceptually, if we want to study the impact of a program on normalizing the sex ratio, really we would only expect to find something in Punjab, not so much in these other areas. That, of course, might beg the question, well, why pilot the program in a lot of areas where sun preference doesn't appear to be an issue? And really, what seems to be going on here is that these other treatment areas were predominantly chosen for the education payouts that occur later in life, because all of these areas had very low female literacy rates and a very high proportion of historically disadvantaged minority groups, especially the scheduled tribes or STs. And so there was just a very different policy interest than in Fatehgarh Sahib, which actually had the lowest sex ratio in all of India in 2001. So that's the first reason to focus on Punjab. Second reason is that unfortunately, even if you wanted to, it's impossible to actually estimate a causal effect in any of the 6 states outside of Punjab due to massive implementation challenges. Mostly these come from high levels of insurgency-related violence during our study period. And in the paper, we actually show that this leads to massive violations of the parallel trend assumption for the difference in difference design that we're going to use. And on top of that, in some states, you actually have an increase in violence that perfectly coincides with the introduction of the program, making it really impossible to disentangle the Dhanlakshmi scheme from the effect of the violence. Also, not surprisingly, maybe if there's a lot of violence going on, there's a lot of anecdotal reports about other kinds of implementation challenges, long laundry list, including low political interest in actually implementing such a small pilot scheme, logistical problems with opening bank accounts, raising awareness of the program, and then confusion with other pre-existing CCTs in some states. Punjab, on the other hand, continuously enrolled program beneficiaries during the entirety of the pilot run. And I should mention that while the program ended in 2013, it only stopped enrolling new beneficiaries. Existing beneficiaries actually keep receiving those payouts. There was a large enrollment by school teachers, which helped raise awareness and also enroll students and girls into the program, and health centers were also very actively involved. It also helps that there were no other competing schemes, so there was no confusion about these benefits. Going to skip this. This is just to show that actually we have no pre-trends on our main outcome of interest, which is just whether a birth was a girl, and so we have no pre-trends in Punjab, but really on all of the other states, we're not surprisingly, based on everything that I've told you, face massive violations in the plausibility of the parallel trends assumption. Yeah, so in terms of data, we're using large-scale household survey data from India. We'll actually combine the DLHS survey, which is 2 rounds from 2007-8, right before Dhanlakshmi, and then from 2013-14, with the NFHS, which allows us to go a bit further out in terms of seeing those girls grow up. We get sort of the typical retrospective birth histories with lots of information about immunization, education outcomes, gender of the child, as well as socio-demographic characteristics of these households. We also have some block level census data that allows us to really zoom in much better on the treatment areas themselves, because unfortunately household survey data is only available at the district level, and since only part of the district is treated, we might think that that might actually underestimate the benefits that we're seeing. In terms of empirical strategy, we're using a difference in difference design, and in our preferred specification, what that will mean is that we're going to compare the treatment district to other control districts in the same state, so in Punjab, before and after the Dhanlaxmi program was implemented. Our main outcome variables, at least initially, are going to be this dummy variable is girl, which just is going to be equal to 1 if a birth was a girl rather than a boy. And then this other dummy variable is birth, which is going to be equal to 1 if a woman had a birth in a given year. When we go to census data, we don't have, unfortunately, fertility information, so we're going to switch to looking at the share of girls in the 0 to 6 year age group. Senate areas are going to be clustered at the district level, or then if we go to census data at the block level. And so that is really our estimating regression equation here. So our outcome of interest here on the left for woman I in district D at time t. We're going to have our main variable of interest here, which is the Dhanlaxmi scheme interacted with the post treatment period, and so beta will be our coefficient of interest. We can add socio-demographic controls, although I'm also going to show you the results without controls, and then district and time fixed effects. This is just to briefly give you an idea of summary statistics. I realize there are a lot of numbers here, but the big takeaway is that actually the treatment district Fatehgarh Sahib looks comparable to the average control group district from the same state on a lot of socio-demographic outcomes. The main difference really occurs based on religious breakdown. So Fatehgarh Sahib has a lower proportion of Hindus and a higher proportion of Sikhs than the comparable typical control group district. And Fatehgarh Sahib is a bit better off socioeconomically, which we're here proxying by the type of housing. And so the Pakar houses here are engineered houses. And so we have a bit of a higher percentage here than we have in the control group district. So because of some of those differences, you might worry about other control groups or spillover effects. And so in the paper, we actually discuss that we find no evidence of spillover effects to non-treated areas within Punjab. But I'm also going to show you the results using 3 alternative control groups that might be plausible based on different assumptions we make. So we'll have the specification none here, which indicates other districts in India that did not have an active girl-child CCT program at the time. Then we might want to take other districts in India that had an active girl-child CCT program, but did not actually start or stop programs. And so that's going to be the no change category here. And then we might actually want to zoom in on culturally similar areas, also in the northwest region of India that you saw on the map has a bigger sun preference issue by taking districts only from other North Indian states in that region, and that will be our northwest specification. I'm not going to show you the results here today, but our results are also robust to using various alternatives to calculate standard errors, including wild cluster bootstrap, randomization inference, or actually collapsing down to the district level. Here's sort of our headline result. So outcome variable here is this IESR-GLO indicator variable. And so what this means is that actually the introduction of Dhanlaxmi led to a 4.5 percentage point increase in the probability that a birth was a girl. So actually a substantial improvement of the sex ratio. When we add controls, this increases a bit. When we change around control groups, as you can see, this effect is very, very robust. And then we can go to the census data, where this is the share of girls out of that 0 to 6 year old cohort. And again, you see an improvement here in the sex ratio. So overall, big improvement in the share of girls here. On the other hand, we only find a small positive fertility increase. So the coefficients here are an order of magnitude smaller, and typically seem to indicate, a tiny increase in the probability that a woman has an extra birth. If we go to the census data, where we look at the size of the cohort of 0 to 6 year olds, we actually don't find a statistically significant impact here at all. We can look at then what happens to son preference. This comes with the usual caveat that this is self-reported by women. They're asked, in your next pregnancy, do you prefer that child to be a boy? And so here, this coefficient would indicate a 5 percentage point reduction in women reporting this son preference. You can see that this is a bit less robust than our headline results, but generally seems to indicate that attitudes might be changing as part of the program as well. Then what we do is we actually can trace those children once they're born and look at their post-birth outcomes. So the first 3 columns here actually look at children or girls 2 years and older that should have had all the compulsory vaccinations according to the Indian vaccination system, and look at the probability or the increase in probability that they have received age-appropriate immunization rounds. They're roughly 3. And so we find about an 8 percentage point increase in sort of the vaccinations that are supposed to be given around the time of birth. And you can see a bit of a leveling off effect here in the 2 later rounds, but very encouraging sign that maybe these conditional immunization payouts are actually working. We can also look at the probability that by the age of 5 and older, these girls are still alive, which unfortunately in India is not automatic, because there tends to be substantial excess female mortality after birth due to neglect of girls. Encouragingly, though, we find actually a very similar coefficient here than we had on the birth outcomes. So most of the girls that are being born because of Dhanlakshmi are actually still around even 5 years later. And then lastly, we can trace these girls up to age 6 to 7 when they should have started school. And so this is just an indicator variable indicating that they are in school now. And we find a 4 percentage point increase of them actually having started school on time. Lastly, we can also look at the impact of the program on older girls. So another actually unique feature of the program was that enrollment didn't have to happen at birth, but could actually also occur later in life when girls had already been born before Dhanlakshmi. The only downside of that is that girls only become eligible for age-appropriate payouts, so there's no retrospective eligibility for earlier payouts. So we look at the education outcomes for 8 to 14-year-old girls, again, looking at in school now, indicator variable, where we actually don't find any effect on these older girls. But we can also look at the years of completed schooling for these girls and actually find that Dhanlakshmi seems to improve educational attainment here by 1/3 of a year, which again is actually a quite substantial effect. And so then just to conclude, in the paper, we actually do a bit of a back of the envelope calculation and find that our coefficients actually seem to imply under plausible assumptions that about 5% of all the births happening in Fatehgarh Sahib in the treatment area, but a whopping 1/3 of all births occurred due to Dhanlakshmi. So again, underscoring the big benefit on the sex ratio with only a small fertility increase. We actually find too that once the program was discontinued, about half of that effect seems to persist even after parents can no longer enroll their newborn girls into the program, again indicating potentially some kind of a change in attitudes in addition to these monetary benefits. All of these are very consistent with anecdotal evidence. There's a nice survey where the researchers really had massive problems finding enough non-beneficiary households in the treatment area in Punjab, because in some villages, virtually every girl that was eligible had been enrolled. And so overall, what this seems to suggest that potentially CCTs can be massively beneficial to help reduce sun preference in India, and that actually the one paper that we know of, the one program that has been studied, might have been suffering from very poor design that should not really really discourage anyone or any of the other programs to be implemented. And with that, thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to any questions or comments.
Thank you so much, Laura, and please unmute yourself if you have questions.
And I'm also seeing a chat question here already from Robert. Did you investigate whether the effects were different for those with different numbers of boys and girls initially? Were they greater in the family if the family only had boys initially? Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks a lot for asking it. Yeah, so we've done a bit to look at how the program effects interact with family composition. And so we certainly find that the effects are largest for the first birth. And so certainly with birth order, there's a smaller effect on the second birth, and then even smaller effect on third birth and up. So that certainly seems to indicate that, yeah, there is a bit of sun preference there still. So on the first birth, maybe you can afford to have a girl, and then you really try for a boy on the higher order births. With respect to the gender attitudes, we've actually looked at whether the sun preference reduction is somehow impacted by you then already having a daughter, because you now have a daughter based on the program that you might not otherwise have had. And quite surprisingly for us, that effect, that reduction in sun preference, still stands even if we condition on families having a girl already.
Okay.
But you're absolutely right that sort of heterogeneity matters a lot. Thank you. So there's another question here by John Young. Effects on number of girls born, would it be explained by selective abortion, the better care of infants, infant mortality? Yeah, that's another great question. So certainly to the extent that it is sex selective abortion, we would probably not be able to catch that even in the household survey, because we're relying on mothers reporting the births they've had. And in India, sex selective abortion is prohibited. So a lot of times you worry about underreporting of sex selective abortions in the surveys, and mothers not even mentioning that they've had a pregnancy. So to the extent that that's happening, we're probably underestimating the benefits here. More commonly, as you're saying, right, I would assume, and the immunization results maybe play into that to some extent too, that a lot of this comes from just better care of infants than post-birth. So a lot of girls die because of preventable diseases, and so the immunizations would actually lower the probability of death for those girls. So that's a great question.
I see, thank you.
And then we have Ning. Is it possible that mothers with less sun preference are more likely to migrate to treatment areas? Yeah, so that's another great question on migration and how that impacts our study findings. So certainly the issue with this pilot is that anyone migrating out of a treatment area would completely lose coverage. Anyone migrating in, as far as we know, will have trouble establishing proof of residency for the first couple of years. So it's unlikely, we think, that there was a lot of migration going on. This is also not a high migration area that we're looking at. But to the extent that that is possible, or that corruption allows some non-beneficiaries to benefit and get enrolled, we can't rule this out completely. So great question.
Okay, thank you, Laura. We now move to the next speaker. Our next speaker is Jingyang Yang from Virginia Tech, and he's going to talk about China's rural pension program and child health. Yes.
Hello, I'm going to share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Hello? Okay.
Yes, we can see that.
Okay, I'm going to zoom in. Okay. Everyone, it's really my pleasure to present our study here at the Jinan University and GLO Joint Conference. This study is a joint study with Dr. Xi Chen at Yale University. Dr. Xi Chen is an associate professor and a health economist at Yale University. And I'm a fourth year PhD student at Virginia Tech, and will become fifth year very soon this fall. And I will also be on the job market this fall, so self-promotion time. For those who, those of you who are looking for job market candidates, I would be very happy to reach out to you. Now back to our topic. So when talking about the child health in China, one of the big picture is that there are huge disparities across regions. It is also the big picture that we will be talking about many topics. A typical divide of the regions is usually by eastern coastal area and the rest of the country. Also, another typical divide is urban area versus rural areas. So to give you an example, here I calculate the BMI for HD score for all the boys age under 15 from age of 6 months. So the BMI for BMI Z-score shows the body weight, standardized the body weight of the children. We see that in here, both for rural and urban boys, the weight of them are really close to each other, and there's not a huge gap here. And if we look closer at this figure, we find that for those in their earlier cohorts, or those age under around the 12 years, they have average positive Z-score, which means they have higher risk of being overweight and obesity. And the fact is also similar when it comes to the girls' weight. But when we look at the height, which can be considered as accumulation of nutrition over time, or a long-term nutritional status, the picture is very different now. So we see that at all ages under 15, under years of 15, there are huge gap between rural and urban areas. And this is true for both boys and the girls. So so the problems in China now is the big problem is we do not have short-term or body child weight problem, but we have long-term nutritional problem about child health. Another fact which has not been talked much in previous studies is that there's even large health gap even within regions. To give an example, a recent study in 2013 by Rosiel and John finds that 33% of elementary school children has anemia in Western China. While meanwhile, at around the same time, 20% of rural children aged 2 to 6 years and 40% of rural children aged 7 to 12 years are overweight and obese. So it's really it's crucial to ask the question that even within the rural area, which is also the study we focus on, how to improve the child nutrition and at the same time avoid overweight and obesity. While there are multiple cash transfers programs in the developing countries, because it's a viable way to redistribute resources due to its improved ability to handle cash transfers over time. And it's also due to that it's less prone to corruption than in-kind transfers. But it is likely less efficient when the target population is not a decision maker, because the recipients of the transfer program really matters in these programs. Another divide of the program of these cash transfers program is by the conditional or unconditional program, such as the Progressor in Mexico is a conditional program that requires the households to fulfill a few guidelines by the government. And the old age pension program in South Africa is a cash transfer directly to the elderly that is unconditional. Well, similar to the old age pension program, our study focused on the new rural pension scheme. A famous study by the Duflo in 2003, sorry, this is not 2003, studies on the multi-generational impacts of the OAP on the child health. In Duflo's study, they find that there's only a robust impact among the grandmothers on the granddaughters, and the other and they find it improves both body weight, the child weight, and the child height in the long term. And but for the China's new rural pension scheme, a lot of the studies examines the impact on, for example, household consumption, health utilization, labor migration, co-residence behavior, but very few of them examine the multi-generation impacts. But there are some significant difference between the OAP and NRPS, which may show some different results here in the context of China. The first big difference is the OAP has a benefit that is twice the median per capita income of Africans in rural areas. But in contrast, the NRPS benefits accounts for less than 10% of rural per capita income in 2012. It's only 55 Chinese yuan per month at that time. And for the in terms of the eligibility, the OAP is mean tested, which means the only household income under certain level can receive the benefits. But NRPS has a more broader eligibility because all residents with rural hukou type and age over 60 generally have the eligibility. And also the fertility rate in South Africa is much higher than China due to the one-child policy in China. So we have two main contributions or takeaways in our study. First is that we find, in contrast to Duflo's paper, only grandfather's impact is robust or significant in our study, and the impact is only insignificant in the boy subsample. And we only find the short-term impact on the grandson's weight, but not height. The other contribution is we find that the unintended consequences of the large cash transfers that can lead to child obesity in developing countries, because previous studies like on the SNAP program in the US find such impact, but our study focused on China, which is the developing country. So why does our study matter? This is because in China, a large proportion of the children is actually mainly taken care by their grandparents, especially in rural areas. So in this bar plot, the bar shows the rate of children that is mainly taken care by parents, by father, mother, grandparents, or themselves, and the percentage of grandparents that mainly take care of their grandchildren is about 1/3 or more than 30%. The data comes from China Family Panel Study. And it is even also, it is also around the same number, around 30% during nighttime for their childcare. Here to give you a background of the NRPS rollout. It started rollout in 2009, but the dramatic coverage only took place after 2011, when the coverage counties increases substantially. And also the participation rate increases dramatically after 2012. In this figure, the solid red line shows the participation rate at each age in 2010, and the two dashed lines show the participation rate in 2012 and 2014 separately. So our data comes from China Family Panel Study, which is a nationwide biannual survey of Chinese households since 2010. It covers 25 provinces and 95% of the total population. We compiled the wave 2012 and 14 data and matched the children under 12 with their households and the grandparents. We exclude wave 2010 because by then only a few counties were covered and the participation rates were very low, as we showed before. And only children with hukou, rural hukou are included in our sample. So overall, we have a sample size of over 7,000. And I divide here, I give you the summary statistics by divide the sample into eligibility status of the household. So for those households who has a male eligibility, we see from this table that they have the highest BMI for BMI Z-score. And also they have the highest obesity rate and overweight rate. And interestingly, they also have the highest underweight rate. And the household with eligibility at first glance also looks like they have worse height instead of compared with the non-eligible households. But since they are also much older than the children in the household without eligibility, there may be a mixture of both cohort effects and also the NRPS effects. So here I give you the table of other summary studies of the household characteristics and also their household demographics, which we are going to control in our study. So here is a regression equation. The first one, we follow the Duflo in 2003. We do not differentiate the pension receipts. So NRPS JCT here represent the pension receipt of household J at county C at time T. And here in equation 2, we further differentiate the pension receipt by male pensioners and the female pensioners. And here the I indicates the dummies of age and the gender of the children, and the H is the household characteristics, including household location, father and mother's age and education, household demographic structure. And here are gamma C and eta T are counted and time fixed effects. We follow Duflo and use an IV approach to address the endogeneity of NRPS enrollment. This extends the further RD approach, since we further distinguish the rural pension received by the grandfathers and grandmothers. Here I will briefly show the first stage results. And in general, we show that the age eligibility is a pretty strong instrument for NRPS receipt. And overall, it has it increases the pension receipt by over 0.4 of probability. And in all columns, the excluded, the F statistics for the excluded instruments are larger than 100. In this table, we show the result for the BMI Z-score. The first panel shows the OLS results that use the NIPS eligibility directly in our regression. And panel B shows the two-stage least square results. We see that by using the 2SLS, since it identifies the local average treatment effect, the point estimate is almost doubled than the OLS results. And but when we compare to Duflo study, our result is mainly driven by the male pensioners, while in their study, it is driven by the female pensioners. And here, the point estimate here reported in our study, which is around 1, is also similar to what is reported in Duflo study, which have a point estimate of 1.2 standard deviation improve on the child weight. So we further look at whether it improved the underweight rate or overweight or child obesity. We find that there's no significant or statistical significant effect on child underweight, but it does increases child overweight rate and also the obesity rate. And this is effect, interestingly, is also driven by the presence of male pensioners. And then we further look at child height, because height is considered as a more like a long-term nutritional outcomes, as a accumulation of nutrition over time. And we use the outcome of height for age Z-score, as well as a stunting rate, which is measured by an indicator that whether a child has a Z-score lower than -2. In none of these results, we find significant results. Then we further look at subsample results, and we find these results are basically driven by the boy subsample. The result on the girl subsample, which got some economically significant result, but cannot, since the standard errors are too large, we are not able to join in a statistical conclusion. Since our result here is pretty uncommon compared to the previous study, it deserves to further explore the mechanisms here. So the most direct way to look at the mechanism is to compare actually nutritional intake. For example, the food consumption and other nutritional intake that consumed by the children of those eligible and non-eligible household. However, the CFPS is lack of such data. So we tested those mechanisms indirectly, first by the income effects, because it is highly correlated with household consumption, and second by time allocation trend, since the time allocated by the grandparents versus parents to child may have different results on the child weight. And the third, we test whether some preferences play a role in our results. So this figure shows a sharp RD design, and it is centralized at age of 60. And I normalized those income at each ages in half years, and by employing this sharp idea, find it do increases household income by 700 Chinese yuan per year. But when we look at the co-residence behavior, because the co-residence of the grandparents with the grandchildren may increases the child weight, as shown and by the previous studies, we do not find any co-residence behavior change here. And we do find some minor effects on adult-child migration, since adult-child migration may lead to bargaining power or of grandparents, or the grandparents need to input more time in childcare. But this effect is too small to explain our whole story. So we further look at who are the main child caregivers. So since CSPS surveyed on all the household surveyed on the adults, household adults, that whether who are the main child caregiver for each child. during daytime and nighttime. We see that for no matter in the full sample or subsamples, there's no significant change that due to this NRPS. And then finally, we tested the sum preference in rural areas by differentiating father's father and the mother's father, because father's father may have more strong preference for son because they carry the family name. And we do find some interesting results here. We find that results are most likely to be driven by the father's father, that is who is eligible for NRPS. The mother's father's impact, while in some regressions, it has some economically significant impact, but the standard errors are too large to join a statistical conclusion. So to conclude, firstly, we find NRPS has positive effect on short-term health status on grandchildren within the household. The effects are likely to be driven by male pensioners on boys. Secondly, NRPS increases rural child overweight obesity rate, but does not decrease the underweight rate. We do not observe any long-term effects of NRPS on the health of grandchildren. The effect of NRPS on grandchildren may not be a pure effect of pension income, since we find in the rule of some preference, as well as we find that there are a slight change due to a slight change of adult-child migration due to the NRPS, and grandparents may the time allocation to childcare may change moderately, and they are lack of proper knowledge of taking care of children. Thank you very much, and this is my presentation today. Thank you. Any questions and comments are welcome, and Dr. Xi Chen will also take in charge with me during the QA session. Thank you.
I'd like to ask you a question. I found it interesting that the caregiver variable had no effect of caregiver, right?
Yep.
So it's not that the grandparents are taking care of the children. It must be that it doesn't matter whether the mother or the grandparents are taking care. They must all have the same preferences. So doesn't that suggest that it's just a general income effect, that the household has more income and the grandparents have more income, the mother has more income, the father has more income, and they're all agreeing on their preferences for food for the children?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, I think we are not able to detect those, substantial change of caregivers switch from parents to grandparents. But consider that, this question only asks who are the main caregivers of the children. So there may be some moderate change of time allocation, but we are not able to test in this study. But yeah, this is and this is the question we are testing here is who are the main child caregivers during daytime and nighttime, and this does not change much, or at least in our findings. So I agree that it's kind of a preference or the knowledge to take care of the children, because as we show that more than 30% of the children actually is mainly taken care by their grandparents before the NRPS. And okay, I think I got a question here by Robert. Did you investigate whether the effects were different for those with different numbers of boys and girls initially? Were they greater if the family only had boys initially? Yeah, this is actually a great question. If the families had the boys initially, we would, if we look at those families who had initially had the boys, it could be we could focus on the effects on the on those only some families, things due to their one-child policy. But that also has a mixture of both the effects of NRPS and also the some preferences, also the one-child policy. So it kind of it's also complex here to look at those families who only has the son in their household. And the other question is by Jun Hyung. Effects as on number of girls born, would it be, no, sorry, this is the previous.
You should look at the last question by Shen Xue. Actually, the other question you answered to was also for the last presentation.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I realized that. Why does only male pensioners have the effect? Usually grandma take care of kids more. Yeah, that's an interesting question. So we think that grandfather, even though grandma could be their main caregiver for the grandchildren, but they could have more time spent with the grandchildren. But for those grandfathers, they may the way they take care of their children is maybe different. They instead of spend time with them, they may just give them pocket money and let them buy buy snacks, buy ice cream, and those pocket money could have significant effects on their nutritional intake or calorie intake of the children. Instead of spending time with them and cooking health food, the way that grandfather spent time with their grandchildren or grandsons may have more adverse effects for their child weight, for their weight. One question from Shen Xue you may see in the chat. Why does only this is the previous question. So do we observe any impact of the program on family transfers, in particular the transfer from parents to grandparents? This could be another channel through which the program affects grandparents' behavioral input into the grandchild. Okay, yeah, this is a great question. But when we examine the effects of the income effects, we take into account of their adult child who is considered as a household member, even though they migrate maybe to urban areas. If the household member identify they are within the same household, then we consider as the household member, and we take into account in the total household income. So when we look at those household income change, we actually take into account those who migrate to the urban areas, but they are considered as a family with those left behind in the rural areas. So that made then maybe sum up effect of both the taken into account in the intra-household transfers. The other question is from Feng Chen. I'm wondering if there are any differences in effects for parents in different cohorts. For parents in different cohorts at the start, for example, post 80s versus post 90s. Yeah, this is a good question. We haven't examined this in our study, but we believe that actually they should be, since the child age is or under 12, and their parents' age will look like very close. But it's worth further exploration for those knowledge, mastered by the parents in born in post 80s and post 90s. Yeah, it's interesting to explore. Yeah, we will do in a further study.
Yes,
thank you very much for all the great questions. This is Xichen from Yale. Yeah, I think the study really comes from the intuition from my rural survey over the past few, like more than 10 years, and I observed two things. One is grandparents tend to spoil grandchildren, and they lack of the knowledge of taking care of children, and they spend the money very differently from their parents in the way of feeding their children, and so that's why we see the in nutrition in China. There's called a double burden. We see a large rate of undernutrition, but as well as children are having higher and higher obesity rate. So that's the double burden. And also, when I was talking to the farmers, I find them spend money very differently in different sources of money differently. For example, the pension, they spend very differently than the other income, perhaps because this is a small proportion of their income, and they're not only like wasting money on some like junk food for their grandchildren, but also if you look at their like transfers from family members to them during the holidays, you can see that they are not like saving much. They are like use more of those income on gambling and other non-productive way of spending. So that was some observations. So even before the NRPS in 2009, when we were visiting those villages, we found those large increase over the few years on the junk food consumption for grandchildren. So that was worrisome. So that promoted us to compare the results between South Africa and China. And yeah, that was some observation. Thank you very much for the comments from Zhang, from Robert and Xuesen and others.
Thank you so much, Jingyang and Professor Chen. Now we need to move to the next speaker. And our third speaker is Michael Crystal from European Commission, and he is also a GLO member. He will talk about the effect of social security program on labor supply. And let's give time to Michael.
Hello, everybody. Thanks a lot. I will start sharing my slides. Can you see them already?
No. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Perfect. Well, first of all, thanks a lot for the invitation to present our research at the IESR-GLO Joint Conference. I will present joint work with my colleague Silvia De Poli from the Joint Research Center of the European Commission. We both work in fiscal policy analysis. What we do here typically is looking at different type of reforms of tax benefit systems and analyze them typically ex ante. So it might be a bit different to the presentation that you saw so far. The title of the presentation will be Trapped in Inactivity, Social Assistance and Labor Supply in Austria. So we focus on Central European country, Austria. A short disclaimer, just to mention that the findings, interpretations, and conclusions that I will that are expressed in this paper and presentations are entirely those of the authors, and they are not attributed to the European Commission. Let me give you a brief outline about the presentation today. I will introduce you briefly in the topic. I will show you a bit of literature overview. Then I will introduce you to the Austrian system of social assistance, and then I will basically show you the data and methodology that we are using, the results, and the conclusion and the outlook that we basically have here. First of all, well, as an introduction, I mean, we know from the literature that financial incentives are related to labor supply decisions of households. There's a lot of literature there, especially related to changes in tax benefit systems, especially changes in taxes are analyzed heavily in the literature. But social assistance, especially when it comes to social assistance reforms, are actually less discussed. I mean, there are some papers that I will show you later, but in general, there is way less evidence on that side in the literature. And what we did actually in this paper is there was a reform in Austria, quite a strong one, that was implemented in 2018, 2019, where a new social assistance scheme was introduced. And this new social assistance scheme basically reduced social assistance mainly for two groups. First of all, for people with low literacy skills, and second of all, for people with a lot of children, or for households with a lot of children. So the idea was there was basically a political discussion ongoing where some people thought there might be some inactivity traps in the more generous social assistance program in Austria. And basically a political discussion started, and the government decided to introduce a new social assistance scheme. I will introduce you in the scheme a bit later to see how the changes in the scheme were in reality. And what we actually tried to do in our paper is we wanted to assess ex ante the first round effects of the reform on the fiscal and redistributive side. So on the one hand, how is society or how socioeconomic indicators influenced by this reform? And in the second step, we also wanted to have a look on whether this reform has an impact on labor supply. Just to mention, I mean, I'm telling you, this is a reform that took place. It's actually only partly true because this reform in Austria was actually introduced by the government and implemented, but 3 months after the implementation, it was called unconstitutional by the Constitutional Court because of unequal treatment between different groups, especially because of this reduction in social assistance for people with low German literacy skills. It was implemented, but after 3 months, it was actually abolished. However, we think it's interesting to have a look on such a reform proposal because it stayed a long time in the political discussion, and I think our results give an interesting insight in what potentially could go on when implementing such a reform. First of all, a quick overview about the literature that is out there. Well, there are several ex post evaluations that use discontinuities in existing social assistance schemes. There's actually the study by Lemieux and Milligan in 2008 that use a sharp discontinuity in the Canadian social assistance scheme, where basically 60%, there's a 60% cut for young individuals without children. They basically found that this more generous social assistance lead to substantial employment reduction. A similar study was then done in 2011 by Bagen and Dole. They use actually also discontinuity in the French social assistance scheme to assess the impact of social assistance on employment. And they basically found that the childless men in France actually were not eligible for social assistance at all. So they took this kind of discontinuity and they found that the social assistance in France reduces employment by about 7 to 10%, depending on the method they are using. Well, ex ante evaluation, as I told you, and as we are doing in this paper, is quite common in the literature, especially when it comes to policy reforms, and they're typically based on standard labor supply models. There's a lot of literature on tax reforms, such as Blundell and others 2000 for the UK, La Berga and others in 2008 for Spain, Peichler and Ziegler for Germany, Ayala and Panigua in 2019, which is a newer one, actually also on Spain. So as you see, they're related to tax reforms and labor supply responses, there's a lot of literature out there. However, for social assistance, there's actually not much out so far related to ex ante evaluations. There's actually one paper that is probably similar to what we are doing, which is Franz and others in 2012, and they analyze actually a reform in Germany where unemployment assistance and social assistance were unified to a single benefit, and they were looking on labor supply, potential labor supply impacts of such a reform. Well, as I told you, I wanted to give you a brief overview about the social assistance system in Austria. What I'm going to present to you now is basically just the standard system that is still in place. The values might have changed a bit because I'm using the one of 2018 because the reform was implemented in 2018. But in general, the social assistance in Austria is based on a minimum income benefit that can be taken up in case of no income, but also in case of an income below the defined guaranteed minimum resources. Standard rates and means tests are mostly harmonized across, on the national level. There's actually some differences across regions, but they are really minor because there was a huge attempt to harmonize them on national level. Just to mention, in our analysis, we use the rules in Vienna because, well, basically because they are the most common ones, and also most of the recipients of social assistance in Austria are based in Vienna, as I will show you later. And the Austrian system is also characterized by a substantial non-take-up of social assistance. So this is a bit related to the keynote we heard today. I mean, there's several reasons. There's a study by Fuchs and others that basically suggests that the most likely reason behind this big non-take-up of social assistance is information problem, because many people or many families, especially families with children, might not be aware of being eligible for social assistance because they can get quite to big levels, as I will show you later. Just to give you an overview, well, the minimum standards for social assistance in 2019 in Austria is actually about 885 euros for singles and lone parents. Then additional adults in non-single household would get another 640 euros. Then for each children, you will get another 440 euros, for example. And if they are already full-aged, and minor children actually would get about 240 euros additionally. So you sum up this on household level, and this would be the social assistance that a household would receive. And if you have an income that is below this minimum standard in your household, you can basically top up your income to this level. And this, depending on the age of the household or head of the household, you can either get this 12 times a year or even 14 times a year. So these are monthly values. To give you an overview where the recipients of the social assistance in Austria are typically, in which region they are. As you can see, the 9 regions of Austria, and at the end, the total level. And you see that most of the recipients, well, individuals, there are in total 290,000 recipients of social assistance in Austria. And most of them, namely 167,000, are in Vienna. So this is about, I don't know, I think about more than 60% of the recipients are actually in Vienna. And share of population overall, about 3% in Austria, about 3% of the population in Austria are recipients of social assistance. The share in Vienna is about 8.8%. So compared to the other regions, there's an overrepresentation of social assistance receivers in Vienna. And the total expenditures, which is the column on the right side, are about 1 billion euros in Austria. So yeah. And obviously Vienna has the most expenditures related to social assistance due to most of the recipients are placed there. And the other thing that is interesting, because the reform that was implemented was based actually on language skills, which is quite a new reform. I think there are not many countries that really have that such kind of social assistance system. We also had a look on where social assistance recipients are coming from, and well, we see that about half of the recipients have actually Austrian citizenship, while 40% or about 40% are coming from third countries, which are countries outside the European Union. And well, a minor share of about 7% are actually migrants from, or people with citizenship, not in Austria, but within the EU or the EWR. Let me briefly introduce you to the reform that was that was implemented. The reform was called Neue Sozialhilfe, and there were many changes implemented. First of all, couples received slightly less than before. You can see here, couples now received only 1,000, if I remember correctly, 1,240 euros without children. Then families with children, they actually were those that hit most. I will show you later in some simulations. They basically lost a lot of social assistance because children received less in this reform. So basically the idea was to reduce the total amount of social assistance for families with a lot of children, because politically it was meant that they probably should receive lower protection levels. And single parents actually received a bonus. So there was actually an introduction of a bonus for single parents with children. Well, the disabled persons actually would also receive a bonus, but this is something that we couldn't take into account in our simulations. And then the most important one is that people with insufficient German skills. So you either needed to have at least a level B1 in German or C1 in English. That those people that do not fulfill these minimum standards in German language skills will receive only 65% of the maximum amount of social assistance. And this was also the point that I told you before, that was actually against the constitution. So this reform was called unconstitutional after 3 months. To show you the impact of this reform on disposable household income, you see here actually different types of households done with hypothetical data. So we have on the left-hand side a single household with low language skills. You see that before the reform, this household would have received this 800 euros. After the reform, the social assistance would basically drop to about 550 euros. On the right-hand side, a lone parent household, one adult with 2 children, you see there's not much change due to the reform. However, there was this bonus that I told you. So in the reform scenario, which is the green line, these households, if they have low income, they would actually receive a bit slightly more in disposable income than before the reform. And if you look on households with children, for example, here you have, again, in green, the disposable income after the reform, and in red, disposable income before the reform. So for example, a single earner household with 2 adults, where only one of the adult is working, and with 3 children below the age of 14, they would have had a social assistance of about 2,700, I think it's about 2,700 euros in the pre-reform scenario. But after the reform, due to the reduction in social assistance that this household receives for children, they would drop to about 2,300 euros. And the more children you have, the more extreme this reduction in social assistance gets. So on the right-hand side, you see in the case of 5 children here, for example, the social assistance would drop from about 3,700 euros to below 3,000 euros after the reform takes place. To show you a bit what we did, well, methodological wise, we combined 2 models. First, we use a micro simulation model, which is called Euromod, with the 2019 tax benefit system using data from 2017 EOSILC. And we basically set up a labor supply model. This approach is based on the methodology of Bargain and others in 2014, which is a flexible discrete choice model. That was also used by Brewer and others in 2006, or Blandel and others in 2002, to evaluate this impact of tax reforms, and we actually use it to see the impact of this social assistance reform. And what we also had to do actually is we had to add information on literacy skills to Euromod and to the EOSILC data, because we do not know which people in our microdata are really those people that have low literacy skills. So we actually use data from the PIAC, from the Program of International Assessment of Adult Competencies, to estimate a probit model, and then basically to identify in our microdata those migrants that have potentially low literacy skills. Having said this, I mean, this is just to show you in Austria the difference in literacy skills between natives and migrants in 1st and 2nd generation. So we see that obviously, I mean, it's not surprising. It's also the same in other countries. Typically, natives have higher language or German skills in native language skills than migrants. And you see that there are, especially in the 1st generation, quite an amount of people that have low literacy skills. If you look at the blue line on the left-hand side of the distribution, you see there's actually a king. And actually these are exactly the people that would be affected by the social assistance cuts that were intended to be implemented in Austria. As I told you, our labor supply model, well, it's we basically distinguish between 3 household types. We have single females, we have single males, and we have couple households. We set up a deterministic utility function that depends on the hours worked and the wage of the partner. We also introduce actually the fixed cost of starting to work, which you see here in the equation. This is a quite standard model. We introduce taste shifters that are allowing consumption as well as hours worked to vary by age square, the presence of children, and also the age of the children, and education. So it's, as I said, it's quite a standard model in labor supply modeling. What we then do is actually we recalculate for each labor supply choice the consumption of a household. So this is what we need, and this is where our micro simulation model is coming in. So basically for each consumption choice, which is the CIJ here, we actually calculate again based on the earnings, and the female earnings and the male earnings in the household, the non-labor income and the household characteristics. We calculate with the tax benefit, or with the tax benefit function, which is Euromod in this case, each consumption choice that a household could have. And basically we get the consumption of a household depending on the choice that he is making. And then basically we aggregate all sorts of household income and simulate all the benefits that would receive by the household, and we can solve actually within the labor supply model all the choices the household has. Let me show you a bit the results. I mean, the results, first of all, we have general results. We are looking on labor supply elasticities due to changes in labor supply reaction. And in the second step, actually, we use these elasticities to see the impact of this reform. First of all, labor supply elasticities, I mean, they differ quite substantially. Here you see actually the labor supply reactions to a 1% increase in social assistance. And what we see here is that, for example, they are quite low compared to, for example, standard wage elasticities that you could estimate. So they seem to be low, but they are comparatively high for females and also for singles. So this was the first result that we saw. So it seems that females and singles are more likely to be influenced by actually by an increase in social assistance. However, we are interested in a decrease of social assistance mostly. And what we see here, that 1% decrease in social assistance actually, depending on the flexible sample that we are using, for example, on the hours on the left-hand side, a 1% decrease in social assistance will lead to a 0.1% increase in hours worked and a 0.09% increase in participation. And we see again for females, this effect is actually stronger. So if you decrease social assistance, you would expect a bigger impact on females than on males. Well, to show you now the results depending of the reform, I mean, we analyzed this reform and we saw that, well, the overall expenditures for social assistance in Austria were close to 900 million. And we expect that the reform, the general reform, would reduce these expenditures by about 56 million. Additionally, this reduction for people with low language skills would reduce this depending on how many people are really affected, because we can only estimate the people that are really affected by this reform by about 45 to 70 million euros. When we look on the distributional impact of this reform, we see in the lower, obviously, people in the lower income deciles, which are the top columns in this table, are affected, and because those are the people that receive social assistance, they have generally low income. So they would drop, I mean, the equivalent disposable income would drop by about 123 euros in the first two deciles when we look at the reform. And what we find when looking on socioeconomic indicators, we find that the Gini would increase slightly, which is not surprisingly, because we have a drop in income for low income earners, or in the low income deciles, and also the overall at risk of poverty rate seems to decrease, but not significantly. And this is mainly due to the benefits for single parents. But overall, the error for families with children, for example, increases. I mean, it's not surprising because the families with children lose substantial social assistance benefits. And the labor supply effects of the reform, well, here you see again the impact on hours by males and female and on participation. We see that the hours worked would we expect to drop by 0.25%, which is quite low for males, and 0.11% for females. On the participation, again, we see a stronger impact for males than on females, which is a bit surprising because the elasticities we found were actually higher for females than for males, as you know. And then when we look actually on the numbers, I mean, we actually wanted to see really also the differences between the labor supply reactions of natives and migrants. What we see is that overall, for example, we would expect participation of male migrants to increase by about 1,846 1,800 people, and for females about 220. While for migrants, we see actually the numbers are smaller for males, but bigger for females. So about 1,700 would be willing to participate on the labor market, while 850 females would be, migrant females would be supplying their labor on the labor market. Overall, these results are quite interesting because, I mean, we know that migrants are actually influenced by both parts of the reform. First of all, these low literacy skills only hit directly migrants and will reduce social assistance for migrants. And they're also due to the fact that many migrant households have more children than native households. On average, they have more children than native households. They're also more affected by the reduction in the social assistance for children. Let me conclude a bit. Well, as I told you, the reform reduces the expenditures on social assistance by about 100 million, which is not neglectable. We saw that the labor supply effects are quite small, I would say, because we have seen there are about 300,000 social assistance recipients in Austria, and the labor supply effect is about 3,500 men and about 1,100 females. This low labor supply impact has a reason. I mean, I didn't show you this in detail, but in fact, singles are not hit by the reform, except of migrant singles that have low literacy skills. So basically, and those singles are typically the biggest group of social assistance recipients in Austria, and they were not hit by the reform at all. So this might be a reason why the impact is very small. What is also surprising me is that families with children do not react strongly to the substantial reduction in social assistance. This, I mean, that this can be driven by the utility of those families, because they might have, they might value simply staying at home higher than working. And well, we also see lone parents with children actually react to the new benefit because they got the benefit increase and decreased participation. So there's actually also this counteracting effect that we would expect from this reform. And what has to keep in mind, I mean, this reduction for migrants, I mean, we are talking about labor supply, but I mean, this reform also hits those that are probably that have the most problems to find jobs on the labor market, so that the demand side factor is completely left out in our modeling. And it's really questionable whether such a reform that has not a big impact on labor supply in general, and basically also putting pressure on people that are anyway having problems on finding jobs on the labor market because of low literacy skills, will really lead to a big increase in employment. Well, that's from my side. These are just the references. Thanks a lot for listening. I hope I was more or less in time, and I'm happy to hear your comments.
Can I raise a question, which is also in the chat.
Yes, please. I'm trying to get out of the sharing mode. Sorry.
Okay,
Can you
go out first. I can tell you what I mean.
Yes, thanks.
Well, the point is, yes, the reforms from the outside of Austria, so to speak, the reforms look like that this was a large reasoning for the reform was to make it unattractive for migrants to be in Austria, so to speak. So you have looked at and that's, I mean, in principle, the reform academically is interesting because you see the opposite. Yes, not increasing social assistance, but reducing it and see what happens. So that is interesting to study. And now what you're saying is what should be expected. The labor supply of migrants is increasing. Okay, that's what the one thing. But at the others, maybe not so much, but something. And then at the other side, you observe that you could normally observe that people no longer come to Austria. So the inflow of migrants for social to get support, so to speak, that's one of these prejudices we have with when we talk of migration could be much smaller. So the total effect for the Austrian policymaker could have been much larger than you are looking at. This is a misunderstanding, or what? How would you see it? Or have you modeled the migration flows? My prejudice you have not. Maybe I've misunderstood something.
No, we didn't model that actually, and I'm also not sure whether the intention was really to not to make the system less attractive for new migrants. I mean, politically, this reform was sold like to give an incentive to learn the German language. So it was basically sold in this way. So to give an financial incentive. Yes,
okay,
and it was B1, so it was not a high level, but however, there were about 25% of social assistance recipients who had a lower literacy skills than B1. As soon as you would get the B1 certificate, you would be available for. And I think, I mean, it was, as far as I know, there are other countries that have similar systems, however, not exactly the same. So it's not completely new. But anyway, I mean, the reform was against the Austrian constitution, so it never came. I mean, it was in place for only 3 months, I think, in the end. But I agree. I mean, this second round effects we cannot take into account in our study. And also, what is a bit of a pity, but what we want to do is to probably have a look at some point also on the demand side, because obviously, depending on how the demand for low-skilled migrants is, I mean, this effect on the labor market might be diminishing, I guess. I mean, this is just what I would expect, but we didn't have a chance to look at that yet.
Thanks.
Thanks to you.
There's another question, I think, in the chat.
Yes, thanks a lot. Well, fixed cost means you have basically a fixed cost to enter to the labor market. So you usually don't observe, I don't know, for example, people to have, I don't know, 5 hours on the labor market. So you have this jump in there, and typically in labor supply modeling, you model this by putting fixed costs to a household. So it is costly to start working. So it's not for, I mean, it doesn't come for free to enter in the labor market. This is the idea behind the fixed costs. Does that make sense?
The chat says yes, but what variable did you use as an approximate?
Well, this is basically so it's a fixed cost, it's an indicator variable. And I mean, we had to set that to a certain amount of fixed cost. And I think it was, to be honest, I don't remember how high we set it. Actually, we followed the paper of Bargain.
How did you measure it? I think the question is, how did you measure it? I mean, maybe the question Arsena is asking this. Maybe the person can express herself.
Yeah,
Yeah,
thank
she
you.
said, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That's my intention to know. Yeah, how was it measured? But I guess Michael already said. Is it something that you took from the literature, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, because yeah, there are like different approaches, and yeah, I was just curious, what did you use? Thank you.
Yes, probably we should stop here. And thank you so much, Michael, for your interesting talk. And we need to
Thanks a
move.
lot. Yes.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. So we need to move to the last speaker. Our last speaker is Feng Cheng from Tulane University. His paper is about paid family leave in US.
Okay, thank you. It's my great pleasure and to join the IESR-GLO joint conference. My name is Feng Cheng, and I'm a PhD candidate at Tulane University. I'll be on the job market next semester. Today, I'm very happy to present my paper, Does Paid Maternity Leave Save Infant Lives? Evidence from the United States. Okay, first I want to show you the world map of paid maternity leave lengths. So we can see for the green area are countries with paid maternity leave more than 1 year. We can see most of the developed countries like Canada, European country, and Japan have paid leave more than 1 year. However, United States, as the largest developed country in the world, do not have national level paid leave for mothers. In contrast, China, as the largest developing countries, have paid leave for mothers for at least 128 days. So it will be interesting to look at the empirical evidence in the setting of the United States. So paid maternity leave is designed to provide a compensated time off from work so that mother can prepare for and recover for childbirth. To care for the infants is thought to be essential to child development. There are a lot of studies to look at the effect of maternity leave expansions on child development, and generally find positive results on child health or cognitive outcome. These effects are varies from country to country and varies from the length of leave expansions. But generally, most of the studies have been based on the analysis of the surviving infants. So if the paid maternity leave reduces infant death rates, such analysis would understate the effect. So why we may expect that paid maternity leave reduces infant mortality? The paid maternity leave can increase parental care and reduce non-parental care. And the literature shows that non-parental care can increase infectious illness of children. And here I want to share with you a true story from a PhD cohort. She is my classmate. She had a child, and after the outbreak of COVID-19, she took care of her child at home. But this month, she sent the child to summer camp. And last week, almost all children in the summer camp got flu. And interestingly, except for one child, always wear a mask. So the first channel seems to be essential, and also the paid maternity leave can be helpful for parents to arrange appropriate preventive care like immunizations or white child visits. And the literature shows that the preventive care are better, a benefit for infants' health. And the paid maternal leave can increase breastfeeding, and breastfeeding are strong indicators that can reduce infant mortality rate. Also, compared with the unpaid leave, the paid leave, mothers can have the weight replacement, which could be used for better nutrition for kids. And there are also a lot of literature on the transfer program, and from that, the transfer program can reduce infant mortality. So basically, what do we know about the studies of the paid maternity leave on infant mortality? So previous study mostly focused on the European countries and in the period of 20th century. This is because these countries has been widespread adoption or expansion of paid maternal leave in this period. However, for example, some cross-country studies show that a 10-week expansion of paid maternal leave reduced postnatal mortality rate by 4%. However, there are only a few studies from the United States. There is a study to look at the effect of 12 weeks unpaid leave called the Family Medical Leave Act, which was implemented in 1993. And this policy reduced the postnatal mortality rate by 10% for children with college educated and married mothers, as they were more likely to be eligible for this payment. There only one recent study in health service literature on paid family in California is associated with the lower postnatal maternity rate. But this study don't have sufficient examination to validate the core effect. So what we don't know about the paid maternity leave on infant mortality? There are any causal effects of the paid maternity leave in infants on infant mortality in the United States. This question may be interesting because the US is the largest developed country in the world. The mothers have limited access to pre-existing paid leave. So if so, are these effects heterogeneous for different groups of mothers or infants? If the effect size of paid leave in the US different from others? For example, is the effect of paid leave in the US different from unpaid leave in the US, or the paid leave in the US versus paid leave in other developed countries? So basically, in this study, I will answer these questions. Before move to the empirical part, I want to introduce some institutional background of the maternal leave policy in the United States. So in 1978, that is the Pregnancy Discrimination Act. This act requires the states that with disability insurance program to provide paid leave for pregnant mothers. This paid leave varies from 4 to 6 weeks, and for California, it's 6 weeks. In 1993, there is the Family and Medical Leave Act, which provides 12 weeks of unpaid leave. But not everyone eligible for this leave. This leave is this leave is for the mothers employed in a company with 50 employees or more. And in recent years, there is a Family and Medical Leave Insurance Act, which was designed to provide 12 weeks of paid leave. It was proposed in 2013, but not being passed yet. However, there are some states that do have paid leave for mothers. On July 1st, 2004, California became the first state in the US to offer 6 weeks of paid leave, so qualifying works. And the weight replacement rate is around 60 to 70%. As of the year 2020, 6 states have paid family program in effect: California, Jersey, Rhode Island, New York State, Washington State, and the District of Columbia. And some other states announced a similar program will be effective in coming years. So in this study, I will use California's paid family policy as an exogenous opportunity and the core effect of paid maternity leave on infant mortality. So why I focus on California? There are several reasons. First, that it is the first state with PFL, and other states with the PFL share many common elements. And also because it's the first state, it has longer period data to evaluate. So in this paper, I will use data from the year 2000 to 2008, so the year before New Jersey implemented this program. Also for New York State, Washington State, and District of Columbia, because they don't have enough data to empirically test it. And the take-up rate in California is high; it's about 50%. However, for New Jersey, the take-up rate is relatively low. It's about 30%. And the California is more representative because it is it has the highest resident population in the United States. However, for the island, it's very small. For example, the annual infant mortality is around 15. So it's difficult to do a national analysis, only look at Rhode Island. Maybe for the similar reason, there are many studies also look at the effect of California's paid family program. So I will go over this literature briefly. So based on the study found that California's paid family program increased the take-care mothers and they improved labor market outcome of mothers, improved maternal mental health, increased breastfeeding, and improve infant health and early childhood health outcomes. So in this paper, I will use the linked birth and infant death data from the National Vital Statistics System. So in this data set, it has all the births in the United States and all the infant deaths within 1 year old. The identification is the different data. The treated state is California, and the comparison group, the other 49 states plus DC. And post-date is the period after this policy is effective. The outcome interest post-neonatal mortality rate, which was defined as the number of infant deaths between 28 days to 1 year per 1,000 births. And the interesting in this outcome is that most of the PFL taking time is from 6 weeks to 12 months after childbirth. We call that California has the disability insurance, which provides 6 weeks of paid leave. So this policy is expansion from 6 weeks. And please also note that the paid family program in California offers 6 weeks leave, but this 6 weeks leave not necessarily need to be taken consecutively. For example, you can take 1 week and save 5 weeks for future use, as long as within 1 year after childbirth. This data set also has the other outcome like neonatal mortality rates, which is defined as infant death within 28 days, and the fetal mortality, which is the infant death during pregnancy. Those two outcomes are less likely to be influenced by this policy, and I will use them as the principal outcome. The covariates include the birth control and maternal control. Birth control includes the birth weight, the decimal age, sex of birth order, and maternal control includes the maternal age, race, ethnicity, marital status, education attainment, employment status, and family income. Since this data do not contain information who is eligible to benefit from this program, the accident effect will represent the intention to treat it. Typically, studies at the explicit policy varies across states will classify that area at the state level. However, in this case, there are only one treated unit. So there is a few classes from the conventional class of Boston and Estimate. So in this paper, I will follow from Pinto's inference method for situations where there is only one treated unit, and in the presence of a heterosceded state. So this method first adjusts the state residual to eliminate heterosceded state. Then it randomly resample the linear combination of the state adjusted residual and the linear combination that represents the within state difference between the average post-treatment and average pre-treatment outcome then used in the DD estimate. So this method produces a bootstrap the distribution of the treatment effect for determining the significance of the estimate of treatment effect. So in later slides, I will show you the from Pinto p-value. This is the preferred inference method. And also I will present the p-value based on the conventional cluster versus standards, just for reference purpose. Okay, recall that this is a different design, so we want to first test the parallel chain assumption. I did even a study for this policy. You can see before this policy, the effective value, generally there is no significant difference between California and the comparison states. And there is immediate and persistent factor after the program is effective. This table presents the main results of this study. The first column is only include the state fixed effect and year by month fixed effect. Second column includes the first control and third column before control. I will use the third column and then as an example to integrate this result. So compared with the all other states, California's infant mortality rate reduced by 0.135 after this program was effective. Yeah, also did the heterogeneous analysis for subgroups. First, I followed the literature on the infant mortality that divides the infant deaths based on the causes of death. So the internal causes are reasons, a cause of a health-related reason, and the external cause just like an accident. So basically, the results is driven by the health-related reasons rather than accident. And for Pan B is a subgroup based on the mother's race. Generally, we see significant negative effects for the group of people, but it's only significant using conventional p-value rather than Pinto p-value. So this is to be seen as a suggestive evidence. But the effect size is consistent to literature that disadvantaged family benefit more from this program. Now also look at the merit marker versus unmerit markers, and I found a significant negative effect for if it was merit marker. This is because that for California paid family program, not only mothers can claim benefits, but also fathers can take the lead, even though that the take-up rate of fathers is lower than mothers. And then lastly, I look at the subgroup analysis based on child sex. And I found that there are larger effects for infant boys rather than infant girls. This is consistent to literature that infant boys are more vulnerable to shocks in early age than infant girls. Then I did some robustness check with alternative comparison. First, we recall that there are 5 states with temporary disability insurance program of the 4 to 6 weeks PDD. So I used the other 4 states as the comparison group. And secondly, I use the future paid family states. that I mentioned before, because these states may share some common elements with California. Third, there is a report of National Partnership for Women and Family. They rank all states in the United States based on family-friendly policies. So I use the top 25 family-friendly states and the bottom 25 family-friendly states as the comparison group. So the motivation that I did all these revising checks is to deal with the concern that the policy in California might be endogenous. It is possible if there are some unobservable that correlated with this policy and also correlated with the infant mortality, then my measuring results will be biased. So if this concern is true, maybe we should find a smaller or no effect with the first two robustness checks. And for the third robustness check, we should see significantly very different results between across the two alternative control groups. But generally, we don't find such results. All results are consistent to our main results. The panel A is just use the other for TDR states. We can see the results are very similar to our main results, and also for the future, similar for the future PFL states. And for the top 25 family-friendly states and the bottom 25 family-friendly states, all those results are similar to main results, and I don't see significant difference between the these specifications. The product I mentioned before, I will use the neonatal mortality and fetal mortality as the principal test. This is to deal with the concern that the main results was not caused by the paid family policy in California, but under simultaneous shocks. For example, if there are less air pollution or more clean water, and exclusively for California during this period, we also find similar results as my main results. But if that was true, we also expect a significant reduction in the neonatal mortality rate and fetal mortality rate. However, all those results on the two placebo outcomes are not statistically significant. So basically, this just ruled out the possibility that our main results were caused by simultaneous shock in California. Then I'll make a simple comparison of the effect size in this study with the previous studies. So the last result is result for this study, and the last column is the 1 week equivalent effect just for comparison purpose. We can say compared with the competitive in the United States, I found a slightly larger effect in magnitude. And also compared the competitive in the US with the competitive in European countries, the effect size is also slightly larger than previous studies. But generally, all these results are in a similar magnitude. And we can see the 1 week competitive equivalent effect is about reduced infant mortality of 15 to 12 among 1 million numbers. Okay, to conclude, this paper found that California's paid family program reduced personal neonatal mortality by 0.35. Now it received approximately 309 infant lives in California from the period of 2004 to 2008. This effect was driven by deaths from internal causes, and there were larger effects for infants with married mothers of infant boys. And to placebo test on fetal deaths and neonatal deaths ruled out the possibility that other that is the effect on postnatal neonatal rate was caused by the other simultaneous shock in California, and makes me believe that the effect is correct. Okay, this concludes my presentation. Any comments and questions? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Dr. Chen. I have one question. Did you consider to use synthetic control to estimate the effect or not?
Yeah, also did the synthetic control method. The result is very similar to the DD. Thank you. Yeah, Dave.
If you have any questions, you can unmute yourself.
Hi, thank you. I have a quick question. So have you checked other birth outcomes, for example, birth weight of those children?
Yes, I did detect the birth weight and the preterm birth. Further, after some improvement of the birth weight, but it's only significant, use the conventional p-value, but not the frequency p-value.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Chen. Probably we should stop here, and thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much all for providing us very interesting and exciting discussions and presentations. And we will have another 2 sessions tomorrow and the day after tomorrow at a similar time. Hope to see you all tomorrow and after tomorrow, day after tomorrow. See you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.